Well, here's something interesting. Sharia law. Remember how before the election we talked about, Sharon Angle was talking about Sharia law it's not taking hold in the U.S. She made comments about Sharia law. I got an interesting email from a listener saying, while I realize that many states are voting on state questions this election, I was wondering if you had heard about any of the questions that my wonderfully red state of Oklahoma is putting forward. What made me think of this specific question was because I just listened to you talk about the Islamic law permitting women to beat their wives or children as long as there were no visible marks. Basically, a vote for Oklahoma State Question 755 would forbid Oklahoma courts from using Sharia or Islamic or international law to decide cases in our state. Now, this law passed 70 to 30%. Okay, so in Oklahoma, 7 out of 10 people said, you know what? Passing something that makes it against the law to consider international or Sharia or Islamic law in courts is something I want to do. And that passed. Okay? So at face value, it seems logical, right? It's the U.S.
U.S. laws, U.S. policy.
U.S. laws, that's what we use. And here's Sean Hannity chiming in on the matter. Let me play this for you.
All right, it seems only logical that in America, judges would base their rulings on the U.S. Constitution and not the laws of other nations. But increasingly, activist judges have started turning to international precedent in court decisions. Now, this disturbing trend has caused lawmakers in the state of Oklahoma to take matters into their own hands. And this November, residents will be able to vote on a ballot question to ban courts from considering international law in rulings. Now, it's being described.
So a lot of support for this from conservative circles, and it passed. So where did this come from? We have to look into this. So I start researching. Supporters of the law point to a decision in New Jersey where a family court denied a restraining order against an abusive husband because of his Islamic law beliefs. Now, Brigitte Gabriel and Lauren Losoyer cite the decision as the most egregious example of Sharia law penetrating America. Well, it turns out it seems to be the only example of Sharia law penetrating America. But not only that, the most basic Google search shows that it was overturned on an appeal. So even the most egregious example of the penetration was overturned.
It's an interesting case, though.
It is interesting, but it just didn't hold up, right? So if you're not familiar with Brigitte Gabriel, she's being used by conservatives very, very clearly. I find it despicable. She's being used as a Middle Easterner. She's Lebanese, who knows the truth about Muslims, blah, blah, blah. Somewhat like Walid Shabat, although different in the sense that she doesn't claim to be a former terrorist. And she gives voice to, quote, what many in America are thinking, but afraid to say out loud for fear of being labeled racist, bigot, Islamophobic, or intolerant. So, again, the ruling she points to as a penetration of Sharia law was overturned.
You're positive there were no Oklahoma cases that would have brought this about? I
looked up if I could find any other decisions that indicate that there has been a penetration of Sharia law in this country or in Oklahoma. I found nothing. So even SQ755 advocates haven't mentioned any. So do I agree that it's okay for courts to only decide cases based on U.S. law, not Sharia law, not international law? Of course. I don't disagree with that.
Right.
The thing is, SQ755, based on our research, seems both unnecessary and, quite frankly, it seems kind of malicious. Does it not? And here's what I mean. It's unnecessary because, number one, as we saw, there is no real threat unless you believe the extremists like Brigitte Gabriel, based on one overturned decision, that a threat exists. And number two, if there actually were any international law treaties, Lewis, which the U.S. was a part of, that say you need to consider this type of thing, you couldn't amend them away with a state amendment anyway.
Right.
So something like SQ755 would be pointless. It's unnecessary and malicious because, let's be honest, it's a direct singling out and poke in the eye to the Muslim community in Oklahoma and basically anywhere else that people hear about this law. It's an indication of the inflammatory nature. I mean, it's called the Save Our State law. Save our state. If this is really a legal concern, then you wouldn't call it the Save Our State law. You're just being inflammatory. So SQ755, do I agree we need to just consider American law? Yes. Do I believe the law is necessary? No. Do I believe it's malicious? Absolutely. I mean, what do you think?
I agree that it's unnecessary because I'm just assuming that U.S. law would supersede anything in a U.S. court.
Exactly. If there's an international treaty, I talked to a couple of lawyers about this, a state can't just say, we're not going to follow that. We're just going to have people vote.
But I think this is probably the only case when you're dealing with Sharia law in which people could argue religious freedom.
It's the only case when you're talking about where people, I don't think so. What do you mean?
I can't think of any other religion in which, okay, let's just say beating your wife would be actually discussed in religious texts, right? So if you're allowed to completely practice freedom of religion in our country, it's like a conflict of interest here.
Isn't there a separation between church and state? Do whatever you want.
Yeah, well, there's supposed to be, but is there really? No.
Do whatever you want in terms of your religion. If it breaks the law doesn't see the religious teachings. Now, obviously, many would argue, you know what? It does in terms of Christianity.
That's changed. It
clearly has changed. Let's assume that there is separation of church and state. In theory, there would not be a conflict. You are still free to practice whatever religion you want. You just can't
as long as it falls under U.S. law.
You can't do stuff that is against criminal law. That's right.
Right. Well, I mean, I'll agree with you. It's completely unnecessary.
The David Pakman Show is made possible by listeners like you and by Greenfield Savings Bank, building a strong community one account at a time, with neighborhood offices in Greenfield, Amherst, Conway, Shelburne Falls, South Deerfield, and Turners Falls, and online at greenfieldsavings.com. By the Daily Hampshire Gazette and GazetteNet.com, connecting our communities with local news and information. By DIF Design, specializing in custom business websites at DIFdesign.com. Find out more about underwriting The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.